So when Madison was writing the Constitution, or when the Constitutional Convention was called, remember that they were going to throw out the Articles of Confederation. There was no actual amending it. The amendment process was too difficult, too rigid, too rigorous for them to go ahead and actually amend the original articles. So instead, they were just basically going to shred them, and decided that instead they would simply replace them with the Constitution. So they call this Constitutional Convention in 1787, and multiple delegates show up. And again, it is the who's who of everybody who is famous in the United States at the time. All the founding fathers whose names would come to your lips if I asked the question. Your John Adams, your Thomas Jefferson, your Benjamin Franklin, George Washington is there to preside over the hearings to give it a little bit of legitimacy. Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, all these people who had been famous in the Revolutionary days, who had gone on to great prestige and renown. And then there's this guy who's like a friend of a friend, right? And that is basically James Madison. And James Madison had not necessarily been there in the trenches with the rest of the founding fathers. He was a little bit younger. And frankly, he was not an A-lister, like I mentioned. He comes in, and frankly, to give you an accurate depiction of this guy, frankly, Madison was very much the dork of the group, right? He comes in a high school, he kind of would have been sitting at a table by himself until people recognized that he was the smartest person in the class, and then they would have come over to him and worked with him on group projects, because what does the new kind of dorky, eager to please, smart guy, what role does that person always get in any sort of group assignments? Throw it into the chat for me, if you would, please. What do they end up always doing? Yes, all the work. Oh, you're familiar with these people. Perhaps some of you are these people. If so, I empathize. I have sometimes been cast in this role myself, but this is this person, not because I was the smartest, simply because I was the dorkiest and most eager to please. But Madison is this guy, right? He is the guy who is stuffed with this job where they essentially pile upon his desk abstract theory after abstract theory. They sit there and they're like, look, here are Rousseau's ideas on the social contract. Here you go, Madison. Here are John Locke's ideas on consent of the governed. Here are some ideas by Thomas Hobbes from his book Leviathan. These are ways that we don't want to go towards authoritarianism. Here are some ideas on separation of powers. Here are some ideas on checks and balances. I will tell you that it is great to have all of these theories. What is much harder is to actually take them and put them into a cohesive, coherent, enduring, practical list of rules that will last for, again, nearly 250 years at this point. That is the hard part. And so it'd be like, you go up to somebody, and then the end goal you have is basically like football, right? But you're like, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to design a game. We want there to be a ball and some players, and make it fun and crowd pleasing. And those are the abstractions, right? Those are the ideas that you're given. But the actual layout, the actual design of the thing has to go ahead and function. It has to be realistically applicable and practical, and people have to agree on it, and they have to like it. And frankly, you can't screw it up, because remember, they had already had screw up number one with the Articles of Confederation. The people were not going to tolerate a second bout of incompetence. They needed something stable in these new United States of America. Otherwise, again, the founding fathers feared it might be their heads in a basket. So long story short, Madison basically every night works his fingers to the bone, drafting the Constitution and coming up with a workable, functional government. Now, he's not entirely alone. People do go ahead and throw in their assistance, but he does the lion's share of the work. And then when he is done, he goes ahead and he presents it to Federalists, people who are also kind of young and eager to please, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. I'm sure you've heard the song. And he presents it to them, and they think it is just freaking masterful. It is just an absolutely incredibly impressive piece of work. And so they write these essays, this series of essays that you can see here, where they defend the heck out of it. And they're like, this is incredibly well thought out. And yeah, it requires some tweaking here. And certainly there is debate, because not everybody agrees that it's wonderful. But basically they split into two camps at this point. The Federalists, as I'm sure you've heard from APUSH last year, rally around this thing. And they're like, dude, pat on the back, like you did a great job. Yeah, we'll fix a little bit in post, but it is excellent. And then you have the anti-federalists who are like, whoa, slow your roll. Where did the powers of the states go in this document? So the Federalists write a series of more than 80 essays where they sit there and they defend the document. And these become known as the Federalist Papers. You will need to know 4 of them in AP Gov. And then there's one guy who, perhaps due to fear of kind of the fact that the popular kids are all rallying behind this thing, he actually adopts the name Brutus as a pseudonym, and he is an anti-federalist. He doesn't reveal his real name. There's actually still to this day some speculation about exactly who he was, although there are some guesses. But he goes ahead and he writes an anti-federalist paper, which is called Brutus #1. It'd be easier for you, I know, if it was called Anti-Federalist paper #1, but it's not. It's called Brutus #1. And he basically rips on elements of the Constitution that he finds particularly objectionable. Now, before we get to the criticisms, let's talk about the document itself. Madison, in his infinite wisdom, and it was nigh infinite, Madison, in his infinite wisdom, basically identifies from the onset like 4 problems that he is going to have to counteract, right? So let's go over those 4 problems. I'll put them on the screen for you so you can see. Let's go over those 4 problems to make sure that you understand each one. First of all is the problem of what are called factions. Madison recognizes that if we have a democracy, those pluralistic groups are going to wield excessive amounts of power. Because, for instance, in a democracy, usually the way decisions are made is that you have a vote and then the issue is settled, right? It's one and done. And so what he's concerned about is that groups of people will organize, much like I mentioned a second ago. They will organize, they will collect, they will rally around a single issue, right? And they will all turn up to vote as a block on a particular issue, whether at the time that issue is slavery, whether in modern times that issue is abortion, whatever the dominant issue of the day is, right? They will show up and they will vote, and then the issue will simply be decided, and that will be the end of it. And Madison is highly concerned that what will happen is that all future discussion and debate of that issue will be eradicated by a single faction in its power to swing a vote on one specific day in one specific year. Do you understand that? Because it's kind of pivotal to understanding this concept. Like, that's the concern, is that the issue will be voted on and then never brought up again, and it will be controlled by these organized pluralistic groups as opposed to being controlled by individuals. Make sense? Throw it in the chat if it doesn't. So Madison's like, okay, this is why we cannot have a democracy. And in Federalist paper #10, which you see here, the 4th of the 9 documents you need to know for AP Gov, Madison gets up and he says we cannot have a democracy for this very reason. Because if we have a republic instead, if we have representatives who are in a Congress or legislative branch of some sort, then what happens is if they have a vote, and if that vote does swing a particular way, even if you are on the losing side, you can live to fight another day. In other words, let's say that you have a vote on the topic of slavery, right? And the pro-slavery faction goes ahead and they rally in Congress. And they, like 60% of Congress votes that yes, slavery is a thing to have. We should go ahead and have that. It's good for the economy of the South. It's going to create civil war if we try to eradicate it. Let's keep slavery, right? Well, what Madison says is, in a democracy, that'd be it. Slavery would just be the new normal, or the old normal as it goes. Instead, what he says is, as in a republic, those 40% of people who voted against it, they're not done. They can come back and rally over the course of 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and they can continue to bring up the topic of slavery if they feel like it is doing the country a wrong. And they can slowly but surely chip away at that 60%, convince them of the moral imperative of getting rid of slavery, that it's bad for the country, that it's bad morally, that it harms people, et cetera, and they can slowly but surely, because they're still in the fight, the issue has not been settled forever, they can slowly but surely, in a republic, pull people off of that side and bring them over and allow ultimately important issues to go ahead and be settled, not one and done by a faction one time, May 21st in 1792. No, but evolutionarily over time, opinions can change, discussion can be had, debate can continue. That's the essence of Federalist Paper number 10. And I will tell you that if you understand that, you understand the most complicated element of today. So jump into chat if you would please, and either tell me yes or no. And if it's no, feel free to go ahead and tell me what you'd like me to elaborate on again, because I can. You can just send it to me if you don't want to admit it to everybody. I won't say your name. Yes, you understand it, or no, you do not. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of yeses. I'll just go ahead and keep going then. And if anybody needs me to explain something else related to this, I will. There's one other element that I don't want to leave out with regard to Federalist Paper number 10. So Madison, Federalist Paper number 10 again is Madison explaining what I just explained to you. He's explaining why a republic is better for a democracy, because you can allow for persistent debate. He also says in Federalist number 10 that a large republic is better than a small republic, because what he says is, if the country is big, you can distribute these factions all over the world, and all over the country rather. You can spread them out. A faction on the Pacific coast, some people on the Pacific coast who believe the same kind of radical idea as a group of people on the Atlantic coast back in the time, back in 1787, are not going to be able to communicate and not going to be able to coordinate any sort of movement to go ahead and subvert democracy. So he's like, good, like the bigger the country, the better. He would have been a total believer in Manifest Destiny, because he's like, spread these people out. The more you can spread the extremists out, the less likely they will be to factionalize. Now I'll tell you that that is an idea whose time has basically gone ahead and taken down, because nowadays we have the internet, nowadays we have mass communication, et cetera, people are able to radicalize via social media, people are able to factionalize via the telephone. I mean, it was neat. I'm sure by horse and buggy in the 1790s, the larger the country, the better, probably would have been a good idea. But as you can recognize now, obviously it doesn't keep factions from going ahead and collectivizing and grouping up. In other words, the AARP has people everywhere, right? It doesn't just have people like in Austin, Texas. Okay. All right, let's move on. All right. So that's one. That is problem number one that Madison has to deal with. And he deals with it very capably by making us a republic as opposed to a democracy. Problem number two, as you can see here, is power. How do you keep the government from being tyrannical? Well, I'm not going to elaborate on this too much because it's actually something you've read about and heard about since you were children. But the idea is you simply go ahead and you separate powers, and then you provide those powers with the ability to check and balance one another. Now, a lot of my students will use the words separation of powers and checks and balances interchangeably, but they are not 100% the same thing. So let me explain to you very quickly the differences. Separation of powers is precisely what it sounds like. I think I may have mentioned this to you last time. All it means is that you take the power that would be normally invested, for instance, in a monarch, right? And you go ahead and you separate it three ways. You separate it into three branches. That's all separation of powers is. Do not overthink it. Checks and balances is where you give those powers the ability, frankly, to screw one another over. He writes about this in Federalist Paper number 51, the fifth of the 9 documents that you need to know. As you can probably tell, I'm trying to get a lot of these into your lexicon quickly in case I don't know what's going to happen in the next, 16 weeks to you. So I'm at least introducing these to you. So Federalist Paper number 51 is the fifth of the documents you need to know. I'll go ahead and go over all 5 of them again at the very end if you want me to. But basically what Madison says is, he's like, look, I don't trust government any more than you do. Government is a necessary evil. But what I have done is I have made sure that if government ever turns on anybody, it's not going to be the people, it will be itself. And so I have made it so that Congress can turn on the president if he goes ahead and exercises an abuse of power. I have made it so the president can go ahead and veto laws passed by the Congress if they take away the people's rights. I have made it so the judiciary can settle disputes between people of different states. I have made it so that the government, so that theoretically anyway, the federal government can go ahead and judicially review executive or legislative powers out of existence. He's like, I have made it so, precisely so, that the government will fight itself constantly. If it is so busy struggling with itself, then frankly, it will never be able to go ahead and turn on the people. A lot of people complain, frankly, about our modern government and how, like, quote unquote, nothing ever gets done and it's so slow. And that is by design, ladies and gentlemen. He wanted it that way. He thought if the government was slow and cumbersome and plodding and filled with internal strife, then anything that it produced, I realize this is naively optimistic, but he thought that anything it produced would simply be the best possible ideas, because no crappy ideas could possibly emerge from a government that was constantly struggling from within and shooting down its own terrible ideas. So the problems throughout our country that have arisen when checks and balances is flawed. Some people, for instance, would point to FDR, for example, during the New Deal. I know you studied him in APUSH. Some people would point to him and say, like, look, he had the government on lock. He had the Democrats, FDR was a Democrat himself, right? He had the Democrats eating out of the palm of his hand in Congress and basically not really checking and balancing him on anything. Now, the Supreme Court, I know I'm picking on a little known thread, but you see if you remember this. Do you remember the Supreme Court shot down a couple of his New Deal programs? And so what did he try to do? Do you remember? There was seriously court packing. Very good, Callan. He tried to go ahead and essentially say, I'm going to put 3 of my buddies who I know will also eat out of the palm of my hand on the Supreme Court. I'm basically going to expand the roster of the Supreme Court and just make it like, I don't know, like 12 justices. Why not? I can do that. Stab on my finger. And I'm going to make sure that those additional justices are all my friends. And at that point, the country was like, okay, dude, all right, we like you, Grandpa Roosevelt, but you have gone too far. You're starting to drift a little too close to that authoritarianism we see taking hold in Western Europe during this time. And so they went ahead and they shot that down. And one of the objections along those same lines, I give you a Democrat example, I'll give you a Republican example. One of the objections that you see right now, whether you like them or not, is that Trump very much has Republican Congress eating out of the palm of his hand. They very much are aligned with his agenda. And so they're not so much, especially the Senate, serving as a check or balance on him. Now, if you like Republican policies, especially Trumpian policies, because he is very much the guiding star in this, if you like Trumpian policies, you probably approve of this situation. Same thing back during the New Deal. If you liked Roosevelt era policies like the New Deal, you probably would have approved. What I'm telling you is, in neither situation, Democrats in the 30s, nor Republicans in the 2020s, in neither situation is that probably ideal, because the whole point is that Congress is supposed to, at least as intended constitutionally, is supposed to serve as a check or a balance on executive power rather than its enabler. So there it is. Any questions on that? If not, I'm going to move on. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and move on to the third of the problems, and then I will go into the fourth. The third is big versus small states. Madison envisioned, as you can see here, he envisioned that essentially legislative power would be the dominant power in the United States. I know nowadays we think of the president as the dominant power based off what I just described to you, and it really has been pretty much ever since FDR. But the idea originally was that it should be Congress. Congress should go ahead and run the show. Well, ultimately what happened was that there was a lot of discussion and debate in Congress about how states would get their number of representatives apportioned. In other words, like in this legislative branch that they had, what would make it like, how many votes would Virginia get? How many votes would New Jersey get? How many votes would, you know, Massachusetts get? How many votes would South Carolina get? And this was big because, again, they thought the number of representatives they got in Congress would determine their level of say-so in this new federal government that they were creating. So you can see why you'd want more representatives, not fewer. So Madison's like, okay, I'll take some ideas. Guys, what do you think? How should we go ahead and determine representation? And Virginia gets up and they're like, we feel that the number of representatives you get should be based off of population. And everyone's like, boo, hiss, boo, Virginia. Because of course, why is Virginia saying this at this time? Being the very first colony, starting with Jamestown in 1607, this being 1787, they have had 180 years to go ahead and grow a very large what? Yes, they are very high in population. And so they have grown this massive population. And so all these states like New Jersey and Rhode Island are like, man, whatever. Like, you are just saying that because that will allow you to run the show. And Madison's like, well, very well, then New Jersey, what do you think? And New Jersey's like, we say that population should have nothing to do with it. Every state should have precisely the same number of representatives because we are all states in this country. And Virginia's like, oh, whatever. You're just saying that because you have nobody living there. And so, of course, you want to go ahead and have power equal to the mighty and populous Virginia, because otherwise you're going to get lost in the shuffle. It's ridiculous. Our population is like 7 times yours. We should have more say. And there's back and forth and there's arguing. And if you listen to APUSH or in 8th grade history, you know how this situation resolves. Basically, Madison goes ahead and he's like, guys, stop fighting. Connecticut, what do you have to say? And Connecticut's in the back. And they're like, look, Mr. Madison, allow us to present a compromise, a great compromise, if you will, because that is what it is called, the great, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. And they say, how about we go ahead and create a Congress with 2 halves? In one half, the House of Representatives, the number of votes you get will be determined by population. In the other half, the Senate, the number of representatives we get will be determined simply by the fact that the state exists. In other words, that is why to this day, our Congress is what is called bicameral, because it basically incorporates both plans. In the House, again, the number of representatives you get is going to be based off population. For instance, Texas, of course, will have more than Massachusetts, which will have more than North Dakota. But in the Senate, every representative or every state gets precisely 2 senators, and that way they have equal representation in the Senate. So that's how they determine that. Now, of course, South Carolina, which has been quiet up to this point, South Carolina perks up and they're like, excuse me, sir, I say, how about are we going to determine the population of our slave populations and the number of representatives that they will earn us? And Madison's like, you're not. Like, you don't get to count them as population because you don't count them as people. And he's like, he kind of like waves his hand thinking like it's like a ridiculous notion that he's just put it to rest. But the South is like, sir, now listen here, sir. There is no way you will cut our slaves out of this equation or the South will walk and we will bury now and forever your dream of a federal union. Much like they will later threaten during the Civil War. And so basically, Madison and some of the other Federalists are a little bit shocked at their adamance on this. And they're like, so basically what they do is, again, you've probably heard of this. It is like the single most racist compromise in the entire constitutional convention. And basically what they say is, fine, we will allow you mathematically, for the purposes of determining representation, to just count each one of your slaves into this equation as 3/5 of a human being. And this becomes known as the 3/5 compromise. You learn that side of it a lot. Let me tell you what the counterbalance is to that, because there is one. The counterbalance to that is that Congress, actually, they write into the Constitution. This part is like never mentioned in 8th grade history or in 11th, but I'll mention it now. Congress says, look, if we're going to do this, then we're going to end all slave importation as of 1808. In other words, you get about 20 years to go ahead and import all the slaves that you're going to go ahead and import. But at 1808, we closed the door on new slaves being imported from Africa because they were hoping that slavery would just like die on the vine at that point, right? That they could put like an artificial cap on if you're not importing any new slaves, they thought, then slavery would simply go ahead and die. So they sort of helped themselves sleep at night by going ahead and thinking to themselves, well, we compromised on this by giving the southern states a little bit too much power, but slavery will just die in 20 years anyway, so that will simply be the end of that. They were a little naive. The cotton gin, smuggling, slaves having kids and those kids being enslaved, all of that, of course, helped slavery persist for another 50 years thereafter. So that. The last bit is this. Madison has to go ahead and contend with state versus federal power. And one of the things he says is, he's like, and the states are like, look, we are not going to go ahead and surrender statehood as a concept. Massachusetts has its own identity, which is very different from Pennsylvania, which is very different from North Carolina. We're not just going to give it up. And Madison's like, no, you don't have to. The states will actually have the full brunt of decision-making power. He's like, matters of education, you can decide on your own. Matters of public health, you can decide on your own. He's like, the federal government will have certain things that it can do. He's like, but we will make that like a very defined list. And anything not on that list, and I'll tell you, it's things like declare war, run the post office, raise a navy, raise taxes, all those things, right? We'll go into the actual list later. He's like, if it's not on this list, then it defaults to the states to control it. So like, for instance, education is listed nowhere in the federal government's powers. And so education theoretically should belong to the states. Regulating marriage is actually like the civil unions between people. None of that is actually listed in the Constitution under the federal government's power. So that theoretically should go ahead and default to the states as an actual power. Of course, you know, if you've ever, let me give you a quick preview of how this turns out. Of course, you know, if you have ever taken a history class, you remember that the battle between the states and the federal government is not like one and done here, right? Like it's an ebb and a flow. Like for the next, I don't know, forever, we're still struggling with it. For the next 250 years, the federal government and the states will struggle over some of the ambiguity and who gets to control what. But nowadays, it would pretty much be argued that the federal government, it has more thorough control than the states do. It kind of depends on who you ask, but that's generally the consensus. All right. That takes us through everything I needed to explain to you. One more quickly, just for the purposes of reiteration, the 4 problems Madison has to fix are factions, authoritarian power, the problem of big versus small states and how many representatives each one gets, and the idea of whether or not states still get to go ahead and be a thing due to the existence of this federal government. And he solves each one of these. 1, he solves factions by making us a republic instead of a democracy. He solves the issue of power with a combination of checks and balances and separation of powers. He goes ahead and he solves big versus small states by creating a bicameral legislature where both big and small states have their say. And then he goes ahead and controls state versus federal power with the concept of federalism. Anything the federal government does not have listed defaults to the states as a thing that they get to go ahead and control. Are there any questions? You can, here, let me go ahead and stop the recording, and that way I can handle questions in chat, because frankly, handle questions out loud, because frankly, it's easier that way.